Okay. Following World War One and the end of World War One, there's all kinds of trouble and problems in Europe. Europe was in shambles after the First World War, and in shambles means everything was a mess. Uh, Lots of buildings have been destroyed. Obviously, millions of people have been killed. Uh, Cities needed to be rebuilt. So there was all kinds of problems happening in Europe at the time. So these countries either owed lots of money because the Treaty of Versailles said that Germany, for example, had to repay billions of dollars to the countries they had invaded. Other countries that had been invaded by Germany and Austria-Hungary needed to rebuild. And they turned to the United States for help. And the United States at the time was doing very well. We had a very strong economy. So lending money to these countries was good because they were going to pay it back with interest, and that was going to be good for us. But the U.S. was sort of the place everybody was turning to. And then in 1929, the stock market crashed, which sent the entire world into a global crisis because the United States was no longer financially sound and they could no longer make the loans that people were relying on. Another set of problems that arose was the rise of dictators. Because the countries in Europe were so weak politically and economically, it allowed dictators, leaders who have total control, to gain popularity and rise to power. The people wanted somebody that was going to correct the problems that they were having in Europe. They were willing to turn to anybody. So one of these dictators was Lenin. In 1917, they had the Russian Revolution. They overthrew the Tsar. A Tsar was just the Russian word for king or emperor. And Lenin introduced a new type of government to Russia called communism. And Russia changes its name to the Soviet Union. And this is a picture of Lenin right here. And this is the new flag of the Soviet Union. So we had an entirely different government system taking place in Russia called communism. But the deal with communism is they had total control over everything that happened in people's lives. They controlled all the businesses. They controlled all the education. They decided how people were going to live their lives. So there was very little freedom for the average everyday person. When Lenin died, another gentleman named Stalin, and here's a picture of Stalin, Stalin took his place and carried on the communist regime in Russia. We also see a leader named Mussolini, and here's Mussolini right here. He was the leader of Italy, and Mussolini was a fascist. And fascism says that the needs of the country are more important than the needs of the individual. And with this fascist idealism, people started to lose their freedom, started to lose their rights because the government's position was you're less important, people's freedoms are less important than the good of the nation. So we have Mussolini, and then we also have, and he's pictured with one of the most notorious people in the history of the world, Adolf Hitler, who became the leader of Germany during this time in 1933. Hitler and the Nazi Party, that was his political party, took power. Okay, if you remember from our discussions of World War One, at the Treaty of Versailles, the countries of Europe, the Allied countries of Europe, decided to punish Germany for its actions during World War One. The American president, Woodrow Wilson, thought that was a bad idea, thought it would just make Germany mad, and as it turned out, he was right, because Germany starts to build up an army again. And here's a picture of some German soldiers doing their famous goose step, the way they used to march. You may have seen that in old video clips. But Germany slowly but surely breaks the Treaty of Versailles and starts to rebuild their army. And Italy, under Mussolini, decides to invade Ethiopia in 1935. Ethiopia is a country in Africa. Hitler and Mussolini decide to form an alliance. We talked about alliances before. They decided to work together, and they formed the Rome-Berlin Axis. And as we know, Rome is the capital of Italy, and Berlin is the capital of Germany. So Mussolini and Hitler come to an agreement. So they're in an alliance now. By 1938, Hitler's taken Austria. If you remember, Austria was part of that old Austria-Hungary Empire, and Austria is a country that borders Germany, so Germany was easily able to invade and take it over. Next, he takes over Czechoslovakia, which is another country that borders Germany. And by this time, other countries like Great Britain and France are starting to get concerned about what's happening. They hadn't done anything up to this point, but they started to get more and more concerned that Hitler and the Germans were going to keep conquering the countries of Europe until they had conquered everything. So they talked to Germany. They give Hitler some warnings uh, in regards to Poland, because Hitler makes it known that he's planning on taking control of Poland too, which is just to the east of Germany. And Hitler ignores those warnings and attacks Poland, which is what brings France and Great Britain to war with Germany in 1939. Okay, so World War II ends up being about some alliances as well. So we've got the Axis powers, which were Germany and Italy, which we had just discussed. And then, strangely enough, Japan decides to join Germany and Italy in this alliance. And I say strangely because Japan's over in Asia. It's pretty far removed from Europe. But Japan decides to throw in with Germany and Italy. On the other side, we have the Allied forces, primarily led by France and England, just like in World War I. And other countries throughout Europe are involved as well. But most countries of Europe are pretty small and they aren't really able to help much, and they're being conquered by Hitler and Germany faster than they can keep up. In June of 1940, Germany invades France. And again, remember, if you think about the map, France and Germany share a border. So Germany comes right across that border after conquering the Netherlands and Belgium, which are in that little wedge between the two countries. And it gives them even more ground to attack France from. But Germany invades France and takes over France. They occupy France. That's when their armies had pretty much taken control of all of France. And Hitler sets his sights on Great Britain, the United Kingdom, as his next target. Now remember, Great Britain's an island nation. So to get to it, you either have to come across English Channel by boat. What Hitler decided to do was to launch bombings, to use airplanes to launch bombing raids on England, and in particular London. Okay, so they bomb London unmercifully for a pretty long period of time. The London air raids is what it was known as, but the people of England survived and withstood those attacks. Italy also invades North Africa, the northern part of Africa. And remember, we said one of the starting points here was that Italy invaded Ethiopia, which was a country in Africa. So if you remember, we talked about the First World War being called the Great War. It was the biggest war the world had ever seen. It was also referred to as the war to end all wars, because people really thought it would never happen again. But as we're seeing, if you're really looking at this, the Second World War has an even wider scope. All of Europe is involved. Northern Africa is involved. We have an Asian country of Japan involved. And eventually the fighting reaches the South Pacific and the Asian theater. So this war is bigger than anything anyone's ever seen before. And up until this point, the United States still isn't involved. But the Japanese made a fatal error, just like the Germans did in World War I when they started attacking U.S. supply ships, which brought the U.S. into the war. The Japanese decided to bomb the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. Up until that point, the United States was supporting Great Britain and France, but they hadn't put themselves into the war yet. But after the raid on Pearl Harbor, where the Japanese launched a sneak attack and pretty much destroyed most of the Pacific Naval Fleet that was stationed in Pearl Harbor and Hawaii, the United States entered the war. And this picture, before I move on, shows the destruction of one of the ships that was bombed. The Japanese, snuck up on the U.S. Navy. They had no idea that an attack was coming. There was no forewarning, and it happened early in the morning. And the Navy was totally caught off guard, and so ships were bombed, and pretty much everything that was in that Pearl Harbor was destroyed. Okay, one of the more terrible things that happened during the war was called the Holocaust, and I think most of you have probably heard of the Holocaust. But Germany, the Nazi Party of Germany under Adolf Hitler, came up with a philosophy or an idea that they felt it was important to exterminate Jews, to get rid of all the Jews in existence, basically, which I know is a pretty horrendous idea, but they started to round up people that were Jewish, which, again, we've talked about Judaism, it's a religion, and they imprisoned Jews in what were called concentration camps. And this picture, unfortunately, shows a group of men that are in a concentration camp. You can tell they're extremely skinny because they're being starved to death. They're stacked up 4 high on these beds. But these people who had, weren't soldiers, weren't fighting, but they were, because they were of a different background than Germany, and Adolf Hitler had in his head that they were inferior to Germans. He started to round up the Jews and put them into these concentration camps, which basically turned out to be death camps, like Auschwitz in Poland, where millions of Jews were put to death. Estimates are that about 6 million Jews were killed during the Holocaust. And some of the more famous people from this time period are Anne Frank and Oskar Schindler. Anne Frank was a young lady. Some of you may have read her diary, and we might have even read it this year in school, or parts of it. She was a Jewish girl whose family hid from the Nazis up in an attic, and people were good enough to try to protect them from the Nazis. Oskar Schindler, you probably haven't heard of, but he was a businessman that, to try to help the Jews, started to employ them in his factories. And instead of them being shipped out to concentration camps, he convinced the Nazi leadership that they could be put to work in his factories, making things for the Nazi party, for their soldiers. And he saved untold lives by doing that. Okay, the end of World War II. 1943, Allied forces take control of North Africa and Italy, and Mussolini surrenders. So one war is going on in Northern Africa. Lots of tank battles. So if you like World War II, and if you like learning about World War II, and you're interested in tanks at all, that's where most of the tank battles took place, was in Northern Africa, because you're in the desert and wide open spaces, which lends itself to battling with tanks. Some of you that play video games, if you've played Call of Duty World at War, I think it is, they have a whole section of that game where you're in Northern Africa doing tank battles. But the Allied forces, again, that's the United States at this time, Great Britain, France, they take control of Northern Africa, defeat the Germans there and the Italians, and get control of Italy, and Mussolini surrenders. Then on June 1944, one of the more famous days in the history of the World War II takes place, which is D-Day. And D-Day was a day where the United States and the Allied forces launched an attack across the English Channel onto the shores of Normandy, which is in northern France. And it was a full-scale assault to try to get France back from Germany. So they sent in paratroopers behind enemy lines. They came across the English Channel aboard ships and took the beaches and clawed their way back into France, and slowly, over time, pushed the Germans back out of France and gained control of France again. And once they had control of France, they had an entryway to get into Germany. By May of 1945, Germany surrenders. Adolf Hitler, instead of surrendering, he committed suicide as the U.S. forces approached. Now, once the Germans had surrendered, the war wasn't over, because the war in the Pacific was still going on. The war against Japan was still happening. So for a while, the World War II was fought in 3 separate areas, or arenas, as I like to say. It was fought in the European arena, it was fought in the African arena, and it was fought in the Pacific, in Asia. But the United States in 1945 does something that had never been done before, and has never been done since, thank goodness. They dropped an atomic bomb, the first nuclear weapon that was used, on Japan. And this is the mushroom cloud that formed after that. And atomic weapons are extremely deadly, extremely devastating. Japan didn't initially surrender, so a few days later the United States dropped a second atomic bomb on a second city. The 2 cities were Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And after the second bombing, the Japanese leadership surrendered to the United States as well. Results of World War II. And you can see the people that were very excited about the war ending. World War II ended up being the deadliest war in the history of the world, with 50 million dead. Following the Second World War, the world changes quite a bit, and the United States and the Soviet Union start to rise as superpowers, the 2 strongest nations in the world. And pretty much the world sort of picks sides here. They either side with the United States and their democratic ideas, or they side with the Soviet Union. And this big rivalry develops between the United States and the Soviet Union. The United Nations is formed in 1945 with the goal of being a peacekeeping organization around the world, and try to avoid future wars, try to settle differences between countries before it becomes a war.